What if Naruto wasn't just the child of prophecy, but the reincarnation of a legendary chakra smith? A forgotten legacy awakens, reshaping his destiny and the ninja world forever. Arguably, there is no better introduction to the practice and deep-rooted history of chakra smithing than the one written by the man considered the second father of the art. It should be noted that this designation is attributed to him solely due to his own contributions to the field, as evidenced by his numerous historical and scientific writings on the subject. These writings make it clear that the first practitioner of this art was Rikadu Sennin. His own form of the art was simply a derivative of the Sennin's technique, which he discovered by chance before perfecting and refining it. Without the Sennin's unparalleled vision and skill, it would not have been possible to perform the technique in its true form. Uzumaki Naruto demonstrated both humility and expertise in an art that until then had remained largely untapped, and one in which few master spies could claim concrete knowledge. His final work represented the pinnacle of his achievements. Treatise on the Creation of Leaves that Inspire Myths. You may have heard the tales and legends of mythical swords that can wield great power. You may also have heard how they and their wielder have brought entire civilizations to their knees and elevated others to previously unknown heights. However, you may not have heard the stories of those who created such weapons. Furthermore, it is rare to find someone who can give a straight answer as to how weapons of such great and terrible power are forged. There are several ways in which mythical swords are said to have been created. It is believed they were forged in the heart of a volcano or quenched with the blood of 1,000 samurai. It is also believed that the kami themselves bestowed them upon man from the heavens. Some sources suggest they were crafted from the heart, soul, and essence of a truly noble hero. There are even tales of legendary warriors who were bequeathed swords by a mysterious woman living in a lake. It is said that fate foretold this woman would live to see and bring greatness. I have come to inform you that all the legendary stories mentioned, which claim to explain the awesome power of these weapons and their origin, are completely baseless. It's true that swords with these impressive capabilities have always existed. It's a common misconception that swords with extraordinary abilities exist. Among them are those that can control oceans or split mountains in two with a single blow. There are also living swords crafted by a dedicated and skilled blacksmith. However, all of them are man-made. The making of these weapons is carried out by humans of all ages, races, sexes, creeds, religions, and backgrounds. Many of them have crafted weapons so powerful that they have outlived their creators by hundreds of years. In some cases, these weapons have only been buried in time and history due to tragic losses or a massive concerted effort on the part of their enemies. Some of these weapons still exist, though their original creators are no longer known. The power once imbued within them has often been lost without the knowledge or right to wield them. The ability to create and use these sophisticated weapons is often reserved for a select few, due to the confidential nature of the skill and dedication required to understand the immense power behind the techniques involved in their construction. This art form, created by the progenitor of chakra as a lesser form of a technique once believed to belong to the domain of the gods, is known as Bamsu Sozo, or the creation of all things. It is commonly known as chakra smithing. It is the ability to forge, extrude, shape, quench, and temper a weapon through the use of one's own chakra. According to historical sources, Rikadu Sennin, also known as the Sage of the Six Paths, is credited with developing and perfecting this technique during his travels as a monk through the lands that would eventually become known as the Elemental Nations. He did so on a whim, almost as an afterthought. Given his ability to create life with merely a thought, it is perhaps unsurprising that he could also create a sword with an edge so sharp that a traditional scabbard could not even hold it. The story of chakra smithing begins with the seemingly mythical origins of a sword crafted by a man shrouded in myth, legend, and history. The blade, nicknamed Fushuina Edge, or Sloppy Edge, was not named by the man himself, who never saw fit to name so perfect a weapon. Instead, it was named by those unfortunate enough to see the blade's edge in battle. With this weapon, a puzzle was created that would motivate and drive the few skilled enough to even begin to scratch the surface of this art, which was seemingly reserved for Kami herself and the occasional gods among men. A few men even dared to approach. Although the names of many of these master craftsmen have been lost to history, some remain well known. It is believed that one particularly skilled blacksmith was capable of forging legendary weapons on a whim. While these stories may be exaggerated, they are not as far-fetched as some believe. His name, Yaorakai Uzumaki, the dates of his birth and death, and the circumstances surrounding them were likely lost in the siege of his homeland. The same can be said of the vast majority of his knowledge and many of his truly masterful weapons. Only 2 of these weapons are known to have ever left Uzushiogakur, let alone remained outside of it. Only one of these weapons is believed to still exist, though its location and ownership are unknown. This particular weapon was the only one he allowed to be given to a non-Uzumaki. It is said that he gave it to the fire daimyo as a gift in exchange for the hand in marriage of one of his daughters. Although this story is undoubtedly based on historical fact, as the man did indeed marry one of the daimyo's younger daughters, which in turn caused key nobles from both nations to follow the leader's example and intermarry, securing treaties and alliances. Therefore, it is highly likely that the gift of one of his masterpieces for her hand in marriage is a real event. However, there are no explicit records to prove that the sword was part of the deal or if it was even acquired from outside sources. While it is likely that most of his most impressive swords were destroyed by himself or one of his students to prevent them from falling into the hands of Uzushiogakure's enemies, it is believed that some swords still exist outside of his home and final resting place. While these swords may not measure up to even half of what some old stories and scrolls say his masterpieces were capable of, they are still swords with few equals in sight. One of these was a gift from Yaorakai to a close associate and ally, Toburama Senju, the second Hokage. Today, this sword is considered a very valuable asset to Konoha. It was previously misappropriated but has since been recovered. It's difficult to determine Yaorakai's exact level of expertise in this ancient and enigmatic discipline, given the paucity of information available about the individual in question. Only a few of his swords survive, of lesser quality than his truly exceptional works, and there are even fewer documented accounts of his weapons in combat, as he typically left very few survivors. Furthermore, most accounts from those who survived are distorted and shaky at best, due to the trauma of battling the man. Furthermore, witnessing the deaths of so many of your comrades at the hands of such a weapon often leads to exaggeration and demonization, which is a natural response, not a failing of your own. Even if he were also the most prolific writer and mind on the subject of chakra smithing in recorded history, which is both a significant statement and, in fact, a rather limited observation, since most of his manuscripts are based almost entirely on mythical theories and the study of other chakra smiths, many of whom were lesser smiths than he, or are so vague on the subject that they serve only as a history lesson for the uninitiated and a reminder to historians that this skill actually exists. They also demonstrate that even the man himself believed he had never come close to the sage. Even Konoha, the village's and nation's most valued ally, only possesses a limited number of scrolls and fragments of knowledge from this renowned expert in chakra smithing, or even about the capabilities of his most formidable swords. I'm sure he was the person who came closest to achieving the myth of the Fushuina Iji, at least so far. Naruto would be amazed if he weren't literally in the fight of his life. Seeing a truly legendary sword up close is a highly desirable opportunity. However, right now it's being wielded by one of the most dangerous and sociopathic ninja Konohagakure has ever produced, in an attempt to bisect him. As he pondered this, he heard another of the snake's haunting laughter reverberate throughout the forest. Kokukaku, has the young swordsman had enough? And before Naruto could formulate a suitable response, another of the giant trees located in the forest of death collapsed around him, missing his supposedly hidden position by only a meter or two. The legendary sword had passed clean through its base. Kusanagi, Naruto considered. The blade is known as the grass cutter due to its reputed sharpness. At that moment, Naruto was trying to recall all the information he had accumulated throughout his research on legendary weapons and their manufacturing processes. The identity of the blade is unknown, at least to the author of this report. However, the blade's origins can be extrapolated with sufficient knowledge. The blade is believed to have been crafted in an attempt to recreate the original chakra-forged weapon, the Fushuina Iji. It was also designed to evoke the image and mystique of the supposedly divine weapon. Therefore, it is likely that the blade was sharpened to an edge unmatched by traditional methods. Before he could conclude his train of thought, there was the sound of the mythical weapon slicing through the air, accompanied by a telltale rumble beneath his feet. This indicated that the tree he was clinging to had likely been cut cleanly from the base. He reflected that the blade was capable of making a clean cut almost effortlessly. It was unlikely the Sannin had needed to exert much force, let alone chakra, to achieve that depth of cut. This situation is only getting more difficult. Early on, he lost one of his most effective chakra-conducting blades to an adversary with questionable motives. Now, one of the most formidable ninja on the continent is engaged in a seemingly futile effort to clear the entire forest. What goal he pursues is unclear. Naruto suddenly realized that he had no idea what the Sannin was after. It was unlikely the Sannin was after the scrolls. Even if the Sannin killed him and the rest of his team, it wouldn't be difficult to discover that the snake had been there. This would trigger a village-wide manhunt. The Sannin was good, but he couldn't hide inside Konoha for long while being chased like that. So what was the Sannin's interest or goal? It's clear the Sannin has some interest or goal in pursuing me. He's effectively neutralized both the last Uchiha team, which included 2 valuable clan heirs, and my own team, which also included 2 other clan heirs. While they're not on the same level as a Hyuga and an Uchiha, they should attract more of this individual's attention than an orphaned blacksmith. I must ascertain the situation quickly, or the individual in question will inevitably track me down. If Naruto was sure of one thing, it was that getting caught in the path of someone with a sword of that caliber wasn't something he wanted to do again. At least not until he was more adequately prepared, because Naruto highly doubted he'd have as much luck against the White Snake as he had against Zabuza. An A-rank missing nin is a powerful and dangerous foe, but the gap between A rank and S rank is vast. Could it be related to the Kyuubi? It's certainly a possibility, and a very viable one for someone like Orochimaru. However, if that is the goal, it's unclear why the Sannin would engage in such a prolonged and seemingly inconsequential interaction with Naruto. That's precisely what the Sannin does. A ninja of that caliber wouldn't have allowed it to elude him for so long unless he did so intentionally. It's also possible that the target is the Kyuubi, in which case Naruto's escape would be unlikely. The effort and planning required to allow such a powerful prize to escape would be excessive. Therefore, even if that were the true objective, Naruto had to expect it to be something else and plan for it. Otherwise, he would find himself in a very difficult situation. My research into bladesmithing may be the target. Alternatively, if the snake Sannin is as knowledgeable as his counterpart Jiraiya is known to be, could the snake's target be his research into chakra smithing? Occam's razor suggests the simplest and most likely answer is the correct one. What could be more valuable to a power-hungry rogue ninja than 2 dujutsu? Admittedly, Naruto's collective research into chakra smithing has only just begun to scratch the surface of what is truly possible with it. However, the art is so rare that almost no one, not even those with vast and detailed spy networks, could obtain much of it. Furthermore, even the information that was available was always highly encrypted at best, or at worst, so vague that it rarely provided any real insight into the practice itself. It seems likely that the Sannin were after the most powerful Baijuo. In that case, Naruto would find it extremely difficult to escape without significant help. Or they were after Naruto's research into the lost art of chakra forging, in which case Naruto would have a better chance of survival. Even if the legendary ninja managed to kill him and somehow circumvent the seal Naruto had hidden within his body, which would be extremely difficult, especially if he were already dead, there was still a lot to be gained from him if he were captured alive. This meant that the snake would have to be contained. The question, then, was how this information could be used to turn this unwanted and not especially strategic game of hide and tear down every tree in sight into something more advantageous. As Naruto's mind worked in intense chakra-enhanced overdrive, the snake Sannin kept up the pursuit. The snake Sannin remained unseen, save for the devastation he had left in his wake. Naruto looked around from his new chosen hiding place, a crevice or hole at the bottom of a branch of another massive tree. He could see what could only be taken as a sign of the expert craftsmanship and awesome power of the weapon being used to hunt him down. A clearing of felled trees had been created, stretching at least 100 meters across at its widest point and up to 3 times that length. A few clumps of intact trees stood in the clearing, seemingly as a gesture of magnanimity on the part of the Sannin. Naruto's position was somewhat exposed, situated on the periphery of the clearing, which was about 40 meters wide. If I could ascertain the whereabouts of the individual in question, I would be in a position to attempt an escape, he muttered to himself, his composure compromised by the scale of the devastation caused by one of the Sannin pursuing him. It would be prudent to avoid verbalizing one's position in this environment, given the likelihood of being detected by a superior adversary. The voice broke through the silence just above him. "Wow!" Naruto exclaimed in surprise. He quickly descended to the ground, his hiding place having been compromised by an unknown attack from the snake. Naruto twisted his body in the air, trying to correct his trajectory and get a better look at his opponent. All he saw was a sandaled foot flying towards him, followed by the loose, billowing white robes, before said foot made contact with his chest, propelling him even faster towards the ground. With no way to properly correct himself without getting closer to the razor-sharp object his opponent was wielding, Naruto simply braced for impact and hoped his attacker wouldn't use his momentum to drive the legendary sword into something vital. Naruto landed heavily on his back, a foot slamming into his stomach. The weight of his attacker had him pinned to the ground. However, as he struggled, he realized he was also pinned to the ground by something on his right arm, or possibly his forearm. His vision was still blurry, and the dust was just beginning to settle when he saw exactly what was pinning him to the ground. It was one of his own swords, an unnamed one, as he hadn't had the chance to name most of his creations yet. It was a 24-inch long katana, made of high-quality steel, that he had received as a gift for his most recent birthday from Masajiji. He had misplaced the other one during his encounter with the Sannin. The summoning of the snake had caused his tanto to break when he was first ambushed. Even though the sword had been specifically designed to be expendable, he didn't want to lose it. Let's not fight too hard, Naruto-kun. Unless you're interested in losing your hand. Her voice was sweet and melancholic, a stark contrast to the brutality of the situation. I just want to talk. Maybe compare notes, one swordsman to another. Naruto finally looked up and met his attacker's gaze, only now able to tear his gaze away from his own sword, which pierced his arm and embedded deep into the ground beneath him. It was then that he was truly struck by the beauty of his attacker. Her eyes were yellow, snake-like, yet full and human. The sharp lines and angles of her high cheekbones were perfectly complemented by the softness hidden in her complexion and her smooth, perfect skin. He was momentarily stupefied by this strange revelation and responded with a somewhat inappropriate comment under the circumstances. You know, that's a pretty good way to dull a blade. Naruto was convinced he had misheard the sound, and anyone he told this story to would be equally convinced. However, he thought he heard a faint chuckle from the legendary warrior. I must say, you certainly live up to your reputation as a little blacksmith. May I ask what you would like me to do instead? Would you prefer I use the deadly edge of my other blade to immobilize you? He asked in a joking, yet still incredibly threatening tone, while gesturing with the kusanagi still wielded in his dominant hand. Naruto wasn't thrilled with that suggestion. He wasn't sure of the facts, but if the stories were to be believed, the kusanagi was poisonous and sharp. If you could remove it, it would be a great help. A brief nod was the only response he received, but he decided to proceed with caution. By this time, he began to feel discomfort from the sword stuck in his forearm and the difficult terrain on which he had fallen. Furthermore, he was still recovering from his confrontation with the snake. She had engaged him in a long sword fight, which he found both terrifying and disappointing. However, he was aware that it couldn't have lasted more than 30 minutes. He employed a wide range of techniques he had devised beforehand, but she always responded with a smile and a sideways sweep of her sword, which still sent him flying. If you're as smart as I think you are, then you'll understand precisely why I'm unable to do so. It would be unwise to leave both hands free to someone like you, even someone of my caliber. This puzzled Naruto. The logic behind it was sound, given his experience in both swordsmanship and chakra smithing. The process of heating metal with chakra is quite intense and can cause significant damage to the human body if given the opportunity. However, any damage caused was likely self-inflicted, and he could likely heal from it given enough time. Her reasoning was logical and demonstrated an understanding of his level of skill in chakra smithing, though it was likely somewhat outdated. What confused the young man was the pride he felt when a legendary ninja like her described him as a genius and advised him to avoid leaving both hands open, even in that state. No one had ever referred to him as a genius, not even the Hokage, with whom he had lost contact, nor Masamune Jiji, who was one of the few people alive with exact knowledge of his expertise in chakra smithing. He had occasionally been referred to as a prodigious swordsman, though never to his face. However, this didn't stop him from hearing the whispers from time to time. He was brought out of his internal monologue by a light pressure applied by the snake Sannin through his foot, which was still embedded in his abdomen. However, I must say that the craftsmanship displayed in this instrument is truly impressive. The forging lines and the high density of the folding process are clearly visible, but the tensile strength is also quite high. How long did you spend tempering it to achieve such a high combination of both qualities? He asked this question with a slight tilt of his head, his eyes continuing to study the blade. Naruto was, to put it mildly, somewhat bewildered by the situation. It was a surprising and somewhat disconcerting turn of events. Apparently, this individual, who seemed to be in a state of great emotional distress, had gained unauthorized access to Konoha's premises, assumed the identity of a grass nin, and caused extensive damage to a significant portion of the forest. His goal seemed to be to educate himself on the blacksmithing process. The blade was of excellent quality, due in part to the high-grade steel used in its construction and in part to Naruto's own expertise and techniques, developed over years of intensive research. However, it was unlikely to be worth the significantly increased reward, which was likely in the range of several million ryo. He decided the time had come to give her an answer. Given her past behavior, he was reluctant to risk her taking action against him if he displeased her. Well, I'm not sure. Due to the inherent density of the metal, I employed a multi-step annealing process during forging and shaping before tempering. Furthermore, I only tempered the metal for a few hours relative to the process, resulting in a 30 or 40% loss in hardness along the blade's edge. While the process is somewhat complex, it is, in fact, the truth. He learned the basics of this technique from some very old Uzumaki texts he anonymously discovered while still at the academy. Since then, he has continued to refine it. However, he hadn't expected to have this conversation at the end of the fight. He had expected a more violent outcome, including an impaled arm. It's interesting to note that this isn't a completely unheard of process, but rather has several levels. You've clearly practiced and perfected the steps required to achieve a certain percentage. Her response indicated that she was genuinely interested in the subject, at least from her perspective. She didn't have years of experience analyzing the motives and intricacies of S-rank ninja. However, I would appreciate it if you could explain it further. This process appears to be based on techniques from the Uzumaki style of blacksmithing. Is that an accurate assumption? He has a keen sense of observation. Is it possible he's chasing me because I might be an Uzumaki? I don't have any of his distinguishing features, and I've always assumed the name was given to me by the Hokage or someone at the orphanage randomly, or possibly to throw people off track about the Jinchuriki, but he must have noticed my momentary lapse in concentration, despite my obvious discomfort, and interrupted my thoughts. I ask because few have been able to replicate such an impressive feat, even with access to the necessary knowledge. Furthermore, I'm certain Konoha doesn't possess extensive knowledge of the Uzumaki style of blacksmithing. Are you suggesting that I've reproduced the blacksmithing techniques of the Uzumaki? They must be. I began, but she interrupted me again. What I mean is, you've improved the Uzumaki style of swordmaking. To be able to layer such a naturally pure and dense steel so much, yet still properly utilize the annealing process to shape such a thick weapon without it losing any ductility, and then temper it so perfectly that you've reduced the brittle appearance of the molded steel, and to do all of this and create a blade so perfectly flexible yet razor sharp. Naruto was impressed by her mastery of the subject, given how little time he'd spent with her blade. You've made significant strides in the field of non-conductive weapon forging, especially considering the limited time. Although the great clan has been in decline for decades, you've managed to have a remarkable impact. It's impressive to see such progress at such a young age. It's a testament to your dedication and skill. Naruto didn't like the situation, but he saw no viable options for escape. Perhaps if he could create a momentary distraction or a lapse in his seemingly keen concentration, he could formulate a plan. How do you know so much about Uzumaki blacksmithing techniques? Well, how do you think you know so much about the process? She inquired, leaving the question open. It was obvious she wanted me to elaborate on my statement. However, what could she possibly mean by that? It was obvious that he was familiar with the information Naruto had access to. Having recently become a Konoha ninja, he would undoubtedly have had access to more confidential and advanced documents than he did. Furthermore, Naruto was almost certain that Konoha didn't possess a deeper understanding of the style than what he had seen. If so, it would have been logical for other blacksmiths in the village to follow his example. Is it possible that she was the one who provided him with the initial guidance many years ago? However, this was unlikely. Did you send me the information regarding the location of the scrolls? He inquired, believing there was no longer any room for error. How perceptive you are. May I ask if that was a guess, or if you've made the connection before? Her face was now studying mine, before her eyes lit up slightly. Seeming to have found the answers she was looking for in Naruto's gaze, she continued, I see. Well then, tell me one more thing. How strong do you think this sword is? Before Naruto even had a chance to consider the implications of his second question, her sword arm swung across his body in a sharp twist, striking his own blade halfway along its length and slicing it clean through. The handle and guard flew out of his sight, but the other half remained on his arm. His eyes momentarily followed the short arc it formed as it landed somewhere beyond Naruto's field of vision. He took advantage of the opportunity her distraction offered, which he expected to be brief, and tried to control her leg. If he managed to get a grip on her leg, he believed he could inflict enough damage to separate her from his body and extract the sword from his arm. Then he hoped she would continue to distract him or that help would arrive to get him out of trouble. However, in the brief moment it took him to grab her ankle, she was able to respond swiftly. In the blink of an eye, she was able to apply light pressure to the broken portion of his sword, still embedded in her arm, and place the tip of her own sword against his neck, effectively halting his actions. I must warn you, Naruto-kun. I can assure you that I am perfectly capable of driving this blade through your throat. Furthermore, I can confirm that the Kusanagi is just as poisonous, if not more so, than any story you've read about it. At the now agonizing sensation in his arm and the looming threat against his neck, he lay momentarily still. Then he released his grip on her ankle. I think we can agree that this is an improvement. As I'm sure you know, I prefer to be in control of the situation. Therefore, I would advise against any action that would change that. His new position confirmed, Naruto settled back down. He then stopped fiddling with the blade on his forearm. In any case, I must go. I cannot allow Sensei to impose himself. I trust we will have further interactions. With that, the snake Sanin and her legendary weapon turned to clay, and her presence disappeared. Her sinister smile was one of the last features to leave the clay clone she had replaced herself with. This is unacceptable, Naruto said aloud. Then he allowed himself to succumb to the darkness he had been fighting for so long. Naruto woke up on a lumpy mattress in a dark room. The only light source was visible through the door across the room, indicating he was in another room. He took stock of his situation and noticed a few things. First, his wounds had been treated and were more or less healed, although he was still experiencing significant discomfort. Second, he noticed the absence of his personal weapons, which he normally carried with him, although he could still feel some of them sealed in a few select places on his person. Third, there was a secondary bed next to his own, which was unoccupied but had clearly been slept in. Finally, there was the sound of muffled whispers that had been gently increasing in volume, indicating that two individuals were likely approaching the door in front of him. Then, the door opened to reveal his two companions in profile. You are, without a doubt, the most troublesome individual in the entire village. As you know, that section of the forest is estimated to take several generations to recover. Naruto stopped his left hand, which had already reached the seal on his outer thigh that housed a formidable weapon for close combat. This action had not gone unnoticed by the perceptive Nara, who replied reassuringly, "You don't need to draw anything sharp or pointy, Naruto. We're in the Tower of the Forest of Death. Luckily, by the time your fight was over, we had at least woken up and were able to bring you here." "Is Team 7 okay?" Naruto asked, which seemed to surprise Shikamaru a little. However, Naruto was aware of the damage Orochimaru had inflicted on Sasuke and Hinata. At that moment, another voice sounded over Shikamaru's left shoulder. "I'm a little surprised this is your first question. I'd expect you to have asked about your own companions first." And there was Shino, with that characteristic Aburame reasoning, though if Naruto didn't know better, he would have sworn the bug user looked somewhat distressed. "I've already observed the extent of your injuries, Shino, and Shikamaru is relatively easy to remove from a situation. However, the damage he did to Team 7 was worrying." To this, he received at least a dry chuckle from Shikamaru and a similar response from the Aburame heir, which is a notable reaction in that family. Naturally, Shikamaru backs down from a fight easily. After all, he's the laziest of us. This observation didn't go unnoticed by the pineapple-haired ninja, and the cheerful bickering Naruto had come to enjoy between these two over the past few weeks began again. This continued for a few moments before Shikamaru's gaze turned towards him, and Naruto's attempts to distract them didn't go unnoticed. "Naruto, all jokes aside, that fight you were in was serious. It's a miracle you didn't get hurt worse or killed. How did you stay on your feet for so long? I know you can take a beating, but to do it against a Sannin? It's the same question I've been asking myself. It's obvious he was toying with me for most of the fight. But even so, I threw every jutsu and technique I had at him, and he beat me like a doll. But the strangest thing is that when he finally pinned me to the ground with my own sword, he just asked me questions." At this, his two fellow Genin paused. "What do you mean, questions? Were you looking for information about the village?" Shikamaru was already trying to figure out the snake's objectives. "No, nothing like that. He asked about the construction of my sword and other related details." "You mean the sword he took from you and then used to stab you?" "Yes, Shino. The sword he took from me and used to stab me." The answer was clear and concise. "Why would a legendary ninja be interested in your sword? It's not that special, is it?" Naruto simply shook his head at Shikamaru's question. "It's not particularly more special than any other normal sword I've made. The materials were certainly superior to what I can normally get, but it's not like a Sannin couldn't get them anyway. Not that he'd need to. He has the Kusanagi." Hearing this, the two boys in the room looked at Naruto in confusion. "I apologize, Naruto, but since neither Shikamaru nor I know as much about weapons as you do, you'll have to explain what that means." Had Shino just mocked him? "I'm no sword specialist." He ignored Shikamaru's comment that he was a swordsman and continued with his exposition. "However, the Kusanagi is a legendary weapon with a blade said to be capable of cleaving a blade of grass held in the wind. It also confirms something I hadn't understood until now about its nature, that it's also highly poisonous." "How is it possible that you know how sharp the blade is but not that it's poisonous?" Naruto wasn't sure if this was a sincere question or not, but he decided to answer as such. First, reliable information about the weapon is scarce. Furthermore, a significant portion of the available data is unreliable or inaccurate. The nature of historical texts and the sword's inherent characteristics mean that, at some point, individuals may have created forgeries or misidentified a normal weapon as the kusanagi, simply to capitalize on its reputation and intimidation factor. Idiot. He heard, surprisingly this time from Shino. It seemed like the individual in question was trying to make a joke at his expense. I'm not a nerd. Are you one too? I am not. I must respectfully disagree. Before the argument could escalate, a voice chimed in. Let's not get into the details of whether Naruto-kun is a nerd yet. I think we need to have an important discussion. Naruto was already out of bed before the voice finished speaking, recognizing it only by the sound. He stood at attention, or what might be called attention for a ninja. Hokage-sama, Naruto spoke firmly, what brings you here, sir? The elderly Kage's face showed a hint of surprise at this. He wondered where his former student, Naruto-kun, had gone. He remembered how Naruto-kun had once expressed interest in learning the cold jutsu and wearing the distinctive robes and hat. The Kage observed a 13-year-old boy who had been forced to mature prematurely and endured significant challenges. This had shaped him into an exemplary soldier, a label often begrudgingly bestowed upon him by others. Despite this, he remained a Kage, adept at concealing his true nature. First of all, Naruto, I'm here to see you, though I hadn't planned on seeing so much of you. Naruto became abruptly aware of his attire. His attire wasn't entirely inappropriate, but it was certainly more revealing than usual in the presence of a superior, let alone the military leader of a ninja village. He promptly pulled back the bed sheet and covered his lower half as the third Hokage continued his remarks. The true purpose of my visit is to inform the three of you about yesterday's events. Not even Shikamaru expressed amusement at the man's choice of words, though he seemed to be restraining himself from doing so. For about an hour, they reported to the Hokage on the events that had occurred in the Forest of Death. They began with the attack of a large summoned snake, which was evidently intended to corner their team and Team 7. They then described how Orochimaru had appeared just as the two teams were about to collide. He then proceeded to dismantle Naruto's team in a very swift and efficient manner. Both Shino and Shikamaru were left unable to perform their duties, along with a third member of Team 7, who they remembered was named Sakura. Only Hinata, Sasuke, and Naruto remained. Hinata was quickly dispatched, beaten so hard that she fractured several ribs, and Orochimaru then proceeded to engage in a brief but intense duel with Sasuke. After this, he expressed his boredom and used the last Uchiha as a human sword against Naruto. Eventually, he managed to subdue him as well, albeit in a particularly violent manner. At that moment, the Kusanagi joined the fray. As Naruto himself observed, she deployed the weapon in a handle-first manner, which seemed to catch the elderly Hokage somewhat off guard. She then proceeded to use it in an axe-like fashion, slashing at any obstacles that stood in her way and impeded her advance towards Naruto. At one point, Naruto attempted to create distance between himself and the opponent by using a Fuuten dash coupled with a sizable fireball. However, this tactic was unsuccessful, as the opponent simply passed through it. After a while, he chose to flee and go into hiding, using a sizable and expensive explosive tag ball to create a brief interval of separation between himself and Orochimaru. However, he now speculates that he may have been aware of Orochimaru's location the entire time and may have been engaged in leisure or observation. He is not certain. Finally, Naruto gave a detailed account of his final hiding place and how Orochimaru was able to both slam him to the ground and use his own sword, which she had wrested from him earlier in the fight. He had been using Sasuke as a sword and had refused to use his own katana against the unintentional weapon, impaling his forearm and pinning him to the forest floor. He also discussed the unusual questions she had asked Naruto. He omitted the part where she admitted to pointing him in the direction of some very important research. He also provided his own reasoning for his motives, though he assumed the man before him was more than capable of coming to similar or even better conclusions than his own, given his status as the longest reigning Kage in history and his role as the former sensei of the snake. Once all the participants had completed the exam, the Kage informed them that they would have 1 or 2 more hours before the next phase began. Since several teams had already finished, a preliminary match was scheduled to narrow down the field. After their leader left, there was a brief period of silence before Shino initiated a discussion. He asked if anyone else had noticed that Naruto was a nerd. This prompted a reaction from Shikamaru, who shared a look and a chuckle with the bug user. Naruto allowed himself a brief moment of levity before retreating to his bed with a wry smile. He considered the insect ninja's actions and recognized the impact of the joke on his behavior. He exhaled and stated, "I must acknowledge your influence." If Naruto weren't already fatigued and somewhat injured, he might have even been able to throw a few sharp objects at him, even if only partially. However, it seemed that his two companions were aware of his condition and were determined to use this rarely seen advantage over their enigmatic colleague. In response, they all laughed briefly together. They continued mocking him for about an hour before deciding it was time to prepare for the preliminary bouts. Team 7, including Kakashi, has been waiting on the walkways of the Great Hall, which is being used as an arena for the preliminary round of the Chunin exams. Kakashi has been especially concerned about Naruto, and has been keeping an eye on him ever since he saw him. By this time, Naruto was reasonably certain that Shikamaru had devised a method to avoid Kakashi's presence and thus have time to rest while awaiting his own match. Kakashi seemed to be experiencing a range of emotions, ranging from irritation to admiration. Shino, meanwhile, had already secured victory in his fight against an unremarkable hidden mist ninja. Naruto had largely ignored the proceedings, attempting to determine the most favorable odds for winning various matches against various opponents. Following the destruction of his weapon of choice at the hands of the traitorous White Snake and the loss of his second-best weapon at the hands of the Sand Psychopath, who intermittently attempted to burn a hole in Naruto's head with his gaze, Naruto was faced with a shortage of viable weapon options. At the very least, he lacked weapon options he was prepared to use before the start of the final exam. Naturally, he still had a backup katana, albeit of lesser quality than the broken one, and an odachi, both housed in the same sealing matrix on his right arm. However, he had never considered the odachi's length to be an advantage in terms of power. In fact, Naruto felt like he often lost power in his swing and leverage, especially due to how short it was compared to the long odachi. While the katana represented a reliable option, it wasn't a viable solution for every potential encounter. Certain opponents, such as the Sand Psycho with his ability to control waves of sand, would require a different approach. Furthermore, in many potential confrontations, his swords could prove to be a disadvantageous weapon, though this wasn't usually a problem. However, given his current physical condition, he wasn't in optimal condition to fight. However, Naruto was capable of carrying a considerable number of smaller weapons. He wore a standard black short-sleeved ninja shirt, which he had purchased before the exams, underneath a dark body armor similar to those worn by Chunin. Despite the jacket's lack of padding or protection, it still had numerous pockets, something Naruto found convenient. His outfit also included loose-fitting, mostly black pants, lined with additional pockets and whitish trim. It was evident that he was capable of carrying a considerable number of sharp and pointed objects. In addition, Naruto carried concealed on his person a considerable number of throwing knives and other smaller bladed weapons, both sealed and unsealed. The assortment of throwing weapons, which varied in shape, size, and weight, was known only to him. When deployed, they were designed to confuse opponents. By his calculations, which were always accurate when it came to pointy objects, he carried around 45 throwing weapons, not including some copies of smaller, cheaper ones. Some of them were also designed to counter wind techniques. This figure does not include his shuriken and kunai, of which he carried 2 standard keys of each in his pouch. In addition, Naruto had a few more weapons hidden in his sleeves. If necessary, he could also access the seal on his outer left thigh. However, he was reluctant to do so at this early stage of the competition. Compared to the other secret weapons he carried, this one would reveal far less information about his techniques and abilities. While he's not yet adept at using it long range due to his large size, the cutting power and strength he can put behind it make it a solid contender to be a good choice, depending on his potential opponent. This is to request that Naruto Uzumaki and Dosu Kinuta head to the arena floor. This spurred Naruto into action. He started to turn and walk back to the ground, but not before Kakashi gave him a brief smile and a nod, followed by a polite request to avoid embarrassing him. Shikamaru uttered something Naruto wasn't sure if it was encouragement or a bad dream. Shino, always the picture of cool stoicism, just stared at Naruto, who in turn stared back at him through those reflective sunglasses. If only Shino was as quick to cheer him up as he was to mock him. Naruto took his time descending, taking the opportunity to study his opponent. He had earlier watched as the individual used the gauntlet on his right arm to attack a fellow Konoha shinobi during the first phase of the exam. The opponent was a medical nin, with whom Naruto had collaborated on a few missions before being placed on his new, more permanent team. The medical nin's name was Naruto, or something similar. Interaction with the ninja was generally uninteresting. However, it was noteworthy that despite Naruto's evasive maneuvers, Dosu's attack found its target. This underscores the need for Naruto to either resolve the problem or consider a more radical solution, such as severing the mechanism at the elbow. As he is not a Konoha ninja, this is not a priority for him. With his plan of action at least vaguely defined, and the long road he had traveled to get to this point behind him, Naruto now faced a very annoyed-looking Sound Ninja and an exasperated Konoha Jonin. "Are you ready to proceed?" the overqualified referee asked. "I'm confident I can complete this process in a fraction of the time it would take you. Let's proceed to the next step," Dosu stated in an obvious attempt to appear intimidating, a strategy Naruto had encountered numerous times. However, he decided to accept the approach. "I have a question. If I were to sever your arm above the gauntlet, would you consider it a viable option for me to keep the severed limb?" He posed the question genuinely, while employing a certain degree of antagonism toward the Sonic Ninja. Despite his genuine curiosity about the design, he wasn't sure of its purpose. He was curious if it relied on an unknown internal mechanism or if it was a special chamber that allowed or aided in some form of chakra manipulation. The Sound Ninja seemed confused by the question, but then his expression changed to anger. The Jonin referee then intervened to begin the match. Naruto quickly deployed 4 smaller, faster throwing knives, which were released so quickly that most opponents couldn't catch the throw itself and could only follow the projectiles. This allowed him to create some space and potentially identify the function of the device on his arm. The initial 2 attacks caught Dosu off guard as he was still in a partial stance, raising his arm to aim at Naruto. He managed to pierce Naruto's shirt at one point and make contact with his left arm. However, the subsequent attacks were deflected by what Naruto assumed was his arm gauntlet, as he hadn't performed any hand seals. Dosu proceeded to launch a series of concentrated blasts from the gauntlet, which Naruto skillfully dodged. He evaded the initial attack by rolling out of the way, then ran off to gather his thoughts. Is it possible that he uses chakra to channel air through them to perform wind-based attacks without needing to seal his hands? Naruto proceeded to test this hypothesis by throwing 2 knives he had specifically designed for use in lower-intensity wind attacks. While these knives were more aerodynamic than other throwing weapons, the key advantage was their density. He made significant concessions to flexibility in order to achieve greater weight. The result was more vulnerable edges, but this was relatively easy to rectify, especially considering that the knives were designed to cut through soft human tissue rather than block other blades. The 2 heavy knives flew in a straight line, one aimed at Dosu's head and the other at his gauntlet, in an attempt to damage him. However, Dosu merely unleashed another volley of them, this one slightly more powerful than the rapid shots he had used previously, but not particularly noteworthy. Consequently, both knives slowed considerably and stopped before the arrogant Sound Ninja, who seemed somewhat surprised that the weapons didn't fly back toward Naruto. "I'm aware of the Leaf Ninja's penchant for employing unconventional tactics. However, I'm confident that my technique won't be jeopardized by the deployment of additional, more substantial weapons," he stated, maintaining a low stance but continuing to follow Naruto as he circled around him. "No, but I believe I've already identified the problem. I advise you to prepare accordingly." At that, Dosu looked somewhat puzzled, but he simply gritted his teeth and readied his arm to align with Naruto's head. However, by now, Naruto had already discerned the limitations of the young man's technique. While he wasn't yet ready to fully restrain him like a one-trick pony, he was confident in his ability to effectively neutralize him without risking further injury. Unfortunately, the safest option would be to neutralize the weapon. Although he would normally be willing to engage in close combat with this type of opponent, his body was still quite bruised and injured. Therefore, he had to avoid any unnecessary risk of further damage. He evaded the arena for a few seconds, staying still only long enough to allow Dosu to aim at him before running out of the blast radius. As he did so, he flattened himself against the arena wall for a second, pausing in one spot long enough to summon the sword he'd been keeping in the seal on his left thigh and dropping to the ground in front of him before bringing the giant blade up between himself and the sound-wielding ninja. It should be noted that the effects of sonic blasts may differ from those of wind techniques in terms of the perceived solidity of the blast. However, they do not seem to possess the cutting power or momentum typically associated with such techniques. Naruto commented as he replaced the Kubi Kiribocho on his shoulder, keeping a firm grip in case of further actions. Testing his theory of the sound-based attack by taking the brunt of it against Zabuza's stolen sword may have been a bit risky, but it allowed him to not only confirm his working theory, but also assess the power of the technique. Following the reveal of the legendary sword, several gasps and murmurs could be heard throughout the arena. The loudest came from the Mist Ninja team on the opposite side of the floor. The team members seemed angry, as Naruto had anticipated. One of them seemed familiar, though that could have been due to the lighting. The Jonin sensei was the most visibly angry, his hands tightly gripping the railing in front of him, causing it to dent slightly. He also noticed several confused expressions on the Konoha teams. Some Junon were looking at their sensei with obvious questioning expressions, even his own teammates seemed slightly surprised. Or at least Shikamaru seemed that way. Shino was as unreadable as ever, and he assumed the Hokage had already informed Kakashi of his possession of the weapon, because he didn't seem surprised in the least. Or it was equally likely that the individual in question was simply too cool to react. Naruto smiled briefly as he kept his attention on Dosu before abruptly advancing toward the unsuspecting Junon, the great butcher sword held low at his right side. Unprepared in the sense that he didn't know the weapon's significance, he had raised the gauntlet in what he believed to be an effective method of defense against such an attack. However, he was mistaken. His initial shots were slightly off-center, likely due to the surprise of the attack and the speed at which Naruto was moving, especially with such a large weapon. Naruto was able to easily dodge the subsequent shots by ducking and weaving smoothly. However, the sound ninja eventually refocused and let out another shot, which hit its target and was quite powerful. Naruto simply held his sword as vertically in front of him as possible and took the blow calmly, barely slowing down. Naruto concluded his attack by twisting the sword around his body and bringing it back to a low position at his right side, before executing a powerful diagonal slash across Dosu's unsuspecting body. He then used his momentum and that of the large weapon to deliver a decisive blow to his opponent's arm and back, finishing with the sword held high. Dosu's arm, as he had predicted, had been severed at the elbow, and he was now lying on the ground. His body slumped. Initially in disbelief, he fell hard to his knees, and secondly in pain and shock that fell over his face. Naruto simply let the sword, which had previously belonged to the 7 swordsmen of the mist, vanish in a puff of smoke, back into the seal on the outside of his left thigh. The medical team quickly arrived to treat the unconscious fighter. Despite Naruto's objections, they transported his arm to the medical wing. The sound of his hammer striking red-hot steel was all Naruto could think about at the moment. The typical blacksmith's workshop is a noisy and chaotic environment. The intense heat of the forge, the clutter of tools on the workbenches, anvils, and other materials used in the various blacksmithing processes, and the loud noises associated with creating anything from metal create a challenging atmosphere. Furthermore, the presence of very sharp and dangerous weapons, often scattered haphazardly, further contributes to the chaos. However, for Naruto, this was his true home, a safe environment. He considered this place superior to his bedroom, more comfortable than any room in his apartment, and an ideal setting for relaxation. It was where he felt most at ease. That's why it was difficult for him to relax in the presence of distractions. Masamune Jiji had already visited him and insisted on checking on Naruto's well-being. His subsequent behavior had been unprofessional and inappropriate. Naruto, I believe you are aware that this is not a healthy situation for you, your psyche, or those around you, the elderly blacksmith said once more, attempting to appeal to his younger counterpart. Naruto simply ignored the man. He was focused on the short piece of material in front of him, shaping it into the shape he had in mind. His hammer was like the chisel of a master stone carver, no wasted movement or energy, only the precise movements necessary to create the final product. You are aware that I have never asked you to refer to me as anything other than a colleague. Despite my previous guidance and assistance, I have never asked you to address me as your sensei. The old man attempted to initiate communication with him once more. Do you understand why I have done so? Naruto allowed the hammer to strike once more, this time slightly softer than the previous ones. This wasn't due to the words spoken, but to an inherent understanding of what was required. Before returning the billet to the secondary forge created specifically for this process, Naruto proceeded to gather the materials needed for the final touches of the annealing process. The insulating wrappings weren't far behind, as this wasn't the first time they'd been used. However, the blade had been slowly heating up to the temperature Naruto knew was almost perfect for his purposes. He quickly removed the blade and wrapped it in the special material before placing it back in the special forge. This allows the cooling process to be precisely controlled over time, with a maximum accuracy of almost 1/4 degree. At that moment, the more experienced blacksmith observed his younger colleague's work. He carefully examined every movement, technique, and material he had never seen Naruto use in this process before, trying to determine their specific purpose. Is it because of my identity? Naruto paused for a moment before continuing with a different inflection in his deep voice, What, is it me? At this, the man paused for a moment. You know, I never saw you as anything but a child. You were often lively, but never more so. He began his statement in an angry and hurt tone, but ended it in a more thoughtful one. He seemed to look beyond the Uzumaki and his current project as he said this. I was always aware that you referred to me by no other name. I was able to discern qualities that others may not have seen in you, both then and now. He noted a slight twitching of Naruto's ears, which prompted him to continue. I foresaw not only how quickly you would surpass any knowledge or technique I could impart, but also the intensity of your gaze, which I believe to be a defining quality. When I saw it, I realized that I could contribute no more than a small part to the legacy you would leave behind. Having finished his task, Goro Nyudo Masamune turned on his heels and left Naruto's workshop with a brief nod of acknowledgement. For this, Naruto felt grateful, but also a little saddened. He paused only for a moment before returning to his work, though his concentration was slightly less sharp than before. He still wondered about the words of the man who had helped him on his current path in more ways than one. Aware that the sword he had been working on would require a significant investment of time before it was finished, Naruto decided to focus his attention elsewhere. He was confident that Masamune Jiji would be fine, noting that the man was like hardened steel. He made a mental note to speak with him later. However, he had more pressing matters at hand. He was determined never to find himself in a similar situation again. Although he always had a wide array of throwing weapons, he knew their usefulness was limited. He had been able to effectively counter someone like Dosu before, but he wasn't satisfied. He knew that most people weren't naive enough to allow their opponent to discover them so easily. However, in the Forest of Death, Orochimaru had identified and exploited the weaknesses in Naruto's strategy. This was a major setback. He had neutralized one of Naruto's weapons and deprived him of a superior weapon. As a result, Naruto felt vulnerable, despite the arsenal of resources at his disposal. He resisted acknowledging this while he remained in the Forest of Death, but the reality remained. Even if he wasn't currently working on something more powerful, it could certainly solve the problem of being caught without enough weapons for any situation. He'd have to prepare his tattoo seal in ink. After spending a few hours at his forge, Naruto was working on a katana. Instead of replacing the old one, he was creating additional copies of a stronger variety than his usual ones, as having more options is paramount. He was shaping the long, thin ingot into the desired general shape before beginning his special process. This blade was not intended to be the actual replacement, but rather a visual aid. However, this term doesn't fully capture its intended use. The blade is more like a mold that will facilitate the creation of the actual replacement weapons. To be frank, Naruto wasn't sure of the exact methodology he was employing. It was more of an intuitive approach and a general framework than a structured plan. This stood in stark contrast to the rigorous scientific methods he usually adhered to. However, it's often necessary to venture into the unknown to push boundaries. However, this assumption would be incorrect. Although Naruto appears to be a methodical, practical, and logical individual, especially in regard to his blacksmithing, this perception is limited to those unfamiliar with the intricacies of weaponsmithing. It is akin to observing a process from a distance, as he lacks the depth of understanding that an insider possesses. From an internal perspective, it's clear that the process involves two opposing forces, a methodical and disciplined approach versus an intuitive and emotional one. The former is characterized by a principled and structured process that directly contrasts with the more instinctive and spontaneous nature of the latter. This internal dichotomy drives the practitioner forward, prompting them to act on their instincts and strike the right note. However, it also necessitates the use of external methods and measures. This was one of the rarest cases where a hunch could have so much influence on a process. However, Naruto believed it was actually preferable, given that what he was working on was so outside the normal laws of his trade that it bordered on fantasy. He wasn't sure of the viability of this preliminary concept, but believed having a foundation to work from might be beneficial, as he was still in the process of experimenting with the actual methodology he would use to create his support weapons. Chakra smithing, in its purest form, not the watered-down techniques he usually employed. This process is usually quite intense, both due to the chakra demands and the physical effort required of the operator. However, he felt that having a partially completed prototype in front of him while working on the first step might help him visualize the outcome. And if that approach didn't produce the desired result, at least it would help him think more clearly, something that had always been helpful. While Naruto was deep in the process of creating his thinking weapon, another individual approached him. "Naruto-kun?" The elderly voice came from behind him, startling Naruto enough to cause him to partially panic. In his distracted and angry state, Naruto slammed the blade down with excessive force, approximately 3/4 of the way along its length. The result was a slash that wasn't quite sturdy enough. However, Naruto was unaware of his mistake. Hearing the voice, Naruto spun around, the red-hot blade still in his hand. This caused a significant miss due to the thinness of one portion of the blade and the speed at which it was moving. The last third of the blade flew toward the intruder. The Hokage, though somewhat surprised by the sudden appearance of the red-hot metal, was able to deflect it with minimal effort. The blade embedded itself into the brick wall a few meters behind him and to his right, about 2 or 3 centimeters deep. From the lack of burns on his hand and from observing the metal, Naruto deduced that he might have used wind chakra to cushion his hand, preventing any injury. The Hokage, who was still trying to engage in conversation, intervened. "Naruto-kun, I came to discuss, but I certainly didn't expect such a warm welcome." Hearing this, Naruto fully understood the situation. It happened so quickly that he barely noticed, and he fell to his knees in a show of respect for his cage. "I offer my sincere apologies, Hawk." However, Hiruzen interrupted with a simple gesture. "I advise you to be grateful my Anbu are away, as they tend to overreact to these kinds of incidents." His grandfatherly smile was an attempt to disarm the young ninja, though Naruto remained unconvinced. Technically, what he'd done could be considered a form of treason, even if it had only been an accident. "But sir, there could be." Naruto broke off. What recourse did he have? A barely experienced Jonin harming the god of shinobi? Suddenly, Naruto was back in the forest of death, facing off against Orochimaru. It seemed like an outsized response. "Let's agree then that the responsibility falls on me." The old man responded gently, both to cover for Naruto's lost speech and emotional breakdown, and to relieve the Jonin of most of his guilt. He didn't respond to the emotional attempt to assuage his guilt, but the logical one was effective. Naruto was a ninja under his Hokage. He was in no position to contradict him, and he was used to following protocol and orders. He also seemed more comfortable in that role. Naruto, realizing he had no other choice, simply agreed with the fire shadow. He quickly regained his usual professional demeanor. His cage had ordered him to take responsibility for the incident, and he wasn't one to disobey the man at the top of the chain of command. "Also, I came to congratulate you, Naruto-kun, on your performance in the previous round of the exam," Fire Shadow explained, likely referring to his victory in the preliminary round of the Chunin exams just a day earlier. Naruto bowed his head in gratitude and respect to his Hokage. He was the epitome of a shinobi. Hiruzen allowed himself a small sigh. The son of his successor, endowed with a responsibility most mature adults would never be able to handle, was robbed of his only chance at a childhood. From never having the opportunity to make friends or participate in childhood games, from being denied the company of his parents, and from being subjected to excessive pampering. The way Hiruzen treated Naruto is arguably one of his greatest regrets, surpassed only by the way he treated his student Orochimaru. He believed he could atone by ensuring Naruto graduated from the academy a year early. He then attempted to pair him with suitable teammates and a sensei who he believed could provide the guidance and support he needed. However, like many other aspects of Naruto's unfortunate and prematurely ended life, they were also taken from him at an unfortunate and an opportune moment. This was due to the actions of a rogue ninja from the Land of Waves who was on a mission that should never have been authorized. Finally, Hiruzen realized he had dwelled too much on past mistakes and signaled for Naruto to stand. Only when the young man stood, his back straight and posture impeccable, did he speak. "Naruto, I understand that you may be struggling with some of your emotions due to recent events." Naruto's demeanor remained impassive, maintaining an outward appearance of professionalism. Despite remaining silent, the old man persisted, offering an apology. It wasn't the response Naruto had expected from the man. However, he refrained from intervening. "For many things, mainly for the childhood you never got to have." Hearing this, the young ninja's composure faltered, if only briefly, revealing a hint of the frustration and anguish Hiruzen was sure still existed within him. The unexpected nature of his Hokage's statement must have taken him by surprise. "In hindsight, it's clear that I made mistakes and that there were easier ways to fix or avoid them. Unfortunately, I have failed you and not provided you with the normalcy you deserve." At that moment, Naruto chimed in. "You mean the childhood you thought I should have had?" He spoke with a certain bitterness, and his commander, for his part, seemed somewhat surprised. "I assure you, all I wanted was for you to have a normal childhood. You deserved it for many reasons, the least of which was the burden placed on you without your consent. And yet, I never had it. Did I? Because I was the most powerful ninja in the village." Hiruzen interrupted, "My position of authority does not extend to the point where I can impose my will on all the other ninja and civilians in the village. And yet, we find ourselves in a situation where there is a literal execution order to prevent others from speaking of my burden. How would you describe that, Hokage-sama?" he asked, his tone cutting. "Sometimes you have to make sacrifices for the greater good of the village." "The greater good? You mean the greater good, But you express regret for what you perceive as my lost childhood, as if it were beyond your control. You oversee one of the most powerful military institutions on the continent, made up of a team of highly trained mercenaries who report directly to you. And you tell me it was a sacrifice for the greater good, and you expect me to just, what? Thank you for having to make such a difficult decision? He still hadn't moved from his mostly rigid state, but his body language was still abundantly clear to a man as experienced as the god of shinobi. He was hurt and angry. I can assure you, boy. Hiruzen broke off. Assure me of what, Hokage-sama? That you had my interests at heart? Or that the situation was simply beyond your control? I did my best to act in your best interest, Naruto-kun. My goal was to ensure that you grew up to be a man capable of making your parents proud. I do not know the identity of my parents, Hokage-sama. Despite still offering his usual respect, Naruto's tone betrayed a hint of resentment. Furthermore, I would appreciate it if you would refrain from making unfounded claims about my lack of knowledge regarding these individuals. They have misled me for too long, and I am tired of being held back or prevented from pursuing my goals. I would like to understand why, despite this, you believe your actions were in my best interest and aligned with the greater good. My son. This time Hiruzen was interrupted by the younger man, who spoke more forcefully. Please refrain from using such a disrespectful tone with me, Hokage-sama. I'm not your boy. Naruto paused to collect his thoughts before continuing. I can understand the difficulties I've encountered, as you are inclined to refer to them. I can appreciate that. The fourth was simply doing its best to prevent what can truly be attributed to a natural disaster. I understand why I was chosen, but I've learned to overcome quite a few things. I can even understand your inability to force a population into blind acceptance. However, your inability to simply tell me the truth, that you alone know what is best for me, is not something I am willing to accept. The shinobi god's expression showed visible signs of aging with every word that left the young swordsman's mouth. It was the truth, but he had chosen not to accept it. His insistence on trying to hold the boy back, to protect him, or let him be normal, which would never happen, was the root cause of the breakdown of their once strong bond. Hiruzen was aware that Naruto didn't despise him and that Naruto didn't hold him directly responsible for his difficulties. However, he was unable to accept this situation, even now. He had simply stopped caring about his Gigi, who, in his eyes, was just another person in the crowd on the other side of the river. This was the thought that had aged him. Hiruzen, having reached his limit, spoke one last time before leaving the motley workshop. Well, Naruto-kun, I take my leave then. However, I have one last matter to attend to, a visitor who has come to see you. In his place was a man Naruto knew, though he had yet to meet him in person. Standing 6 feet 11 inches tall and with a long mane of white hair, he was Jiraiya of the Sannin. Good morning, the renowned individual said, raising his hand in a gesture that was half greeting and half salute. Hiruzen left Naruto's workshop and looked out at the seemingly empty streets outside. The occasional neighbor was the only notable presence, creating minimal disturbance. After assessing the situation, he gave his wayward student a chance, believing it to be a better chance for success. Naruto had fewer problems with the man, and it also helped that the boy was unaware of the potential problems with the Sannin. With a courteous gesture, the esteemed individual walked away from the scene, accompanied only by the natural elements of the surroundings. Naruto exhaled deeply, his emotions already running high from the multiple interruptions in his workspace. He had assumed the Hokage would be the last visitor, but the man arrived after him. To borrow a word from his teammate, troublesome. Meanwhile, Jiraiya seemed somewhat disappointed by the reception. Is that all? He asked somewhat gruffly. One of the strongest ninja on the continent is in your modest workshop, and that's the best greeting you can offer him? You practically groveled for the old man, whom you almost killed, by the way, and all I get is a sigh. It's evident that you've been monitoring our activities, which is neither a proper nor respectful way to address the leader of our village. Furthermore, established protocols and etiquette dictate that I treat you with the respect and consideration befitting the leader of a shinobi village. However, I haven't seen any stipulation regarding bowing to someone with a fictitious title, Naruto commented. What? A fictitious title? That title commands respect among both Konoha's allies and enemies. It's a title that commands respect and inspires fear. The legendary Toad Sage replied firmly. Didn't you receive that title as a result of losing a 3-on-1 battle against an elderly individual? Naruto asked. Crossing his arms over his chest, Jiraiya replied, I'd be interested to see you refer to Hanzo of the Salamander as an old man in his presence. Well, aside from trying to instill a sense of intimidation through your title, which your wayward colleague has already achieved, I don't know why you're interrupting me. This response caught the white-haired man by surprise, who hadn't expected such a strong display of disapproval from Naruto. My goal is to prepare you for the final Chunin exams, he stated, trying to bring the discussion back into focus. While it seems like a tempting offer, I think I'll have to pass, he said bluntly, causing the man to back down. He already had a plan in place, and it wasn't feasible to waste valuable time playing with this individual. He could teach him a thing or two, but nothing that would significantly improve his performance in time for the exams, and certainly nothing that aligned with Naruto's style. Even Naruto was forced to stop and reflect on the matter. Was it really accurate to assume that a living legend like that couldn't offer any improvement, even if the man in question had some flaws, like Kakashi-sensei? However, what are your plans in this regard? I've observed the lineup, and while you are a capable competitor, the Hyuga is a formidable opponent. Furthermore, your next opponent, Gaara of the Sand, presents a significant challenge. Naruto was somewhat taken aback by this assessment. He felt capable of taking on the Sand Ninja alone. I would appreciate it if you didn't underestimate my abilities or the strategies I employ, he replied. Didn't the Hyuga graduate one spot ahead of you in class? The Toad Summoner inquired, leaving the rest of his question unanswered. I transferred late and was a year younger than him. He poses as much of a threat to me as I do to Orochimaru. Naruto immediately regretted his choice of words. He didn't regret mentioning Orochimaru, but he was aware that he had underestimated the Hyuga prodigy. He was confident he could defeat him, especially with his most powerful weapon, the Naginata, which would render the Hyuga's preferred style ineffective. That's a bold statement, the man said, emphasizing the word bold. Could you explain how you would neutralize one of the village's most dangerous taijutsu styles so easily? Furthermore, I'm not convinced a sword would be an effective solution. I realize that a clan of that caliber would undoubtedly have a multitude of alternative strategies for dealing with this challenge. Each ninja likely carries a dozen such solutions with them. The Sanin's question gave Naruto pause. It wasn't due to a lack of knowledge, but rather a need to determine the most appropriate response. Naruto, like many other blacksmiths and ninjas in general, is intensely secretive about his techniques. He invested years of research, training, practice, and trial and error to reach his current level. He's not willing to share that information with just anyone. The Sanin incorrectly interpreted Naruto's silence as a sign of hesitation, so he continued, according to my sources, it seems you displayed a similar level of arrogance in your mission to complete, and that doesn't. The taller ninja was interrupted before he could finish speaking. Please refrain from commenting on matters you have no knowledge of, Naruto chimed in, his tone indicating his displeasure. The Sanin seemed momentarily at a loss for words to respond. That mission was an unfortunate aberration, a debacle that should never have happened. His tone was still quite audible, but Naruto quickly regained his composure before continuing. No after-action report can provide insight into the circumstances that unfolded in that challenging environment, Naruto stated, his tone growing serious. I regret to say I lost them. He trailed off. Jiraiya paused, his expression darkening briefly, before continuing, this is not the first time a mission has not been completed as planned. However, you have achieved your stated objective. The stated objective is irrelevant, Naruto stated. I'm aware that other missions have gone wrong. As a ninja, I'm aware that death is a constant risk. However, this doesn't make the situation any easier or better. How many times does one lose some of the only people they've ever cared about, and then get recognized for it? Jiraiya seemed speechless, his expression indicating a deep understanding gained from overcoming the challenges of his profession. He concluded there was nothing more to be done. No words could bring them back, and nothing he said would provide additional meaning for Naruto. Ever since that mission, I've been punishing myself. I've failed them. I'm a living weapon, and I let a rogue swordsman take them down. He felt wetness on his cheek, but told himself it was sweat from the heat of the now dying forge. I couldn't attend my colleagues' funerals because their families wouldn't allow it. The Sanin didn't know how to respond, so he allowed Naruto to continue. She was hit by Zabuza's attack, which was originally intended for me. All because of a drunken bridge builder in a country that failed to defend itself against a tyrant right under their noses. Jiraiya, a Sanin of formidable reputation, how would you react if that happened to you? Naruto seemed ready to continue, but his own overwhelming emotions held him back. The heat in the room was palpable, and it wasn't coming from the forge. However, you managed to defeat one of the 7 swordsmen of the mist, Jiraiya ventured. I neutralized the threat, but I felt no satisfaction. Her throat was becoming noticeably hoarse from suppressing her emotions, but she continued. I didn't mean to. Zabuza had already killed our Jounin sensei and severely wounded me before running through Ichiro as if I wasn't even there. Then he turned on me, and I could barely get back up. Instead of fleeing as I'd repeatedly advised, Yui charged and met the blow almost head on. I had to watch the life drain from her eyes. Could you clarify how you actually hit him, Naruto? The report doesn't specify the details. It's kind of funny, Naruto said lamely. I think I've proven I can be an effective communicator. He was on the verge of laughter. He answered the question by stating, I had created a unique sword with the intention of using it against other weapons experts. In essence, the sword was magnetized, allowing it to deflect randomly thrown kunai or shuriken, or to confuse other swordsmen when our blades met. It wasn't much, but I guess every inch counts. Jiraiya's eyes widened in realization. If we had done it through normal Fuinjutsu means, it certainly wouldn't have been omitted from the report. However, since it had been, it must have been something much more secret. At the time, it was still in its prototype stage, but it produced a relatively strong magnetic field. Occasionally, it would malfunction and pull at the kunai in its sheath. Furthermore, when I used the sword to block a strong blow from Zabuza's blade, its shattered lead caused it to malfunction slightly. This may be due to the inherent properties of magnets, though I'm not sure. The fragments then erupted in a similar fashion to a game of tag, with one or two of them narrowly avoiding Zabuza's blade and entering his throat. Naruto concluded, his appearance visibly shaken by the incident. Jiraiya seemed to be considering what to say next, perhaps an apology. However, Naruto intervened. Please leave my workshop, he requested.